Huge, isn't it, Will? The Premier League champions reinforcing their ranks. They've agreed a deal with Aston Villa to sign the Aston Villa centre-back, Ezri Konsa. Now, we reported earlier today that they were in advanced talks with Aston Villa. Now, Konsa is someone Arsenal have long admired, but I think there was quite a big gap in evaluation. Aston Villa initially evaluating him for around £60 million. Arsenal have been able to bring that down to £51 million. And this is hugely significant, Will, because, you saw how powerful they were against Manchester City on Sunday, and you still look at the options they had in that position with William Saliba out. They still had Gabriel, Mosquera, Pierre Capier on the bench as well. But this Arsenal side under Mikel Arteta, it's another sign of intention to retain their title and also go for more. Ezri Konsa, an England international we saw in the World Cup, coming off a huge Europa League win as well with Aston Villa. Just feels like huge news that Arsenal have agreed a deal for Ezri Konsa for £51 million.
Yeah, and it's a big decision, isn't it, from Konsa himself? Of course, it would be a massive move to go to the Champions, but he's leaving a Champions League starting spot to potentially, when everyone's fit for Arsenal, be cover.
It's a valid point, for sure, but there's been a huge summer of change at Aston Villa, Will. I mean, it's an absolute valid point that they'll have Champions League football, but they've also lost some hugely significant players. In terms of Yuri Tillmans, Morgan Rogers, Emi Martinez's future looks uncertain. And I think at Arsenal, you do have that gap with William Saliba out for the foreseeable future. Who knows when his comeback could be? It looks like it could be at the end of the year. And also, Arsenal had clearly been looking at someone like Konsa or Jarell Konsa as well, someone who can play at centre-back as well as right-back. And we've seen Ezri Konsa do that in Europe, but also for England on that international level. So the fact he can play right-back, I think, is a huge strength that clearly Mikel Arteta wanted to reinforce his side with. But you list the defenders they have, at full-back as well, with Miles Lewis-Skelly, with, Ben White, with Ricardo Calafiori. The strength and depth is quite impressive. I guess the knock-on to this, and the question will be, what does this mean for someone like a Miles Lewis-Skelly and Ethan Nwaneri and Gabriel Martinelli? Will Arsenal now need to balance the books and potentially sell one of those big stars?
If they go for Jarell Konsa as well, it's going to get very confusing this season, isn't it, at the Emirates, certainly for the commentators. But look, there will be, Dan, Villa fans watching, and I'm sure if I can read the Villa room, some of them will be absolutely raging, given the big names that are leaving and potentially going to leave Villa Park.
Absolutely. And I think the shock of some of the moves, I think, Morgan Rogers felt like that was always expected. So I think although that hurt to see him, grow up at Aston Villa and perform so well, I think a lot of Aston Villa fans understood that move. But I think, for example, Yuri Tillmans joining Manchester United, that felt like it came out of nowhere with that release clause. Emi Martinez is in another situation at the club for the second summer in a row where it looks like he is likely to depart. And we know Ollie Watkins, who has been such a key figure at the club in recent years. I've used to cover Villa quite extensively. He is a huge fan favourite. He's attracting interest. And I think my colleague Anton said it earlier, it feels in the summer that almost every player at Aston Villa has a price. And I think this is another example of that, with Arsenal agreeing £51 million for Konsa. But then now you wonder, will Ollie Watkins stay at the club? What are the other squad members thinking about all of these departures? The only thing you would say is Unai Emery has done an incredible job rebuilding this team over and over again, competing with the best, not just in Europe, but in the Premier League. So it's another huge job on his hands.
And what do we read into the Arsenal transfer strategy? The fact that Bruno Guimaraes is the same age as Ezri Konsa, 28, that they're not interested in. Well, they may well make some of those signings, but in terms of the tried and tested, that's what they're going for here now. Two players that they know can slip in and start big games.
Konsa's England experience adds another layer. Playing international football exposes a defender to a different kind of pressure. There is no room for prolonged adaptation. One mistake can dominate headlines. One great performance can establish your reputation. And competing alongside other elite defenders gives players a different understanding of the game. For Arsenal, having an established international defender in the squad can only strengthen the competition for places. And competition is exactly what Arteta wants. Nobody should feel guaranteed a starting position. Every player needs to perform. That internal competition pushes standards higher. And that could be one of the hidden benefits of bringing Konsa into the squad. But what about Ben White? Now we get to the part that Arsenal supporters will be watching very closely. Ben White. The report suggests that Konsa's arrival could increase the possibility of White leaving Arsenal. Again, we need to be careful here. This is a claim from the source material. It is not an official announcement. There is no confirmation in the material provided that White has decided to leave, but the logic is understandable. If Konsa can provide cover at right back and centre back, Arteta suddenly has another extremely versatile defensive option. That changes the squad balance, and Arsenal may have to make decisions about which players remain central to the project. White has been an important player for Arsenal. His ability to play right back and centre back has made him particularly useful. So the question isn't whether White has quality. He clearly does. The question is whether Arsenal's defensive plans are evolving. And if they are, there could be movement. That is why Konsa's signing could have consequences beyond the transfer itself. What Arsenal would actually be getting. Let's imagine the deal goes through. Arsenal announce Konsa. £50 million. England international. Premier League proven. European experience. Versatility. What changes? First, Arsenal gain another experienced defender. Second, Arteta gets more flexibility. Third, the competition for defensive positions becomes significantly stronger. And fourth, Arsenal gain protection against injuries. Those four things can make a major difference across an entire season. Because Arsenal aren't trying to build a squad that can survive one competition. They're trying to build a squad capable of competing everywhere. And that requires depth. The bigger Arteta strategy. This is where we have to zoom out. Arteta's recruitment strategy has increasingly focused on players who can perform multiple functions. Players who aren't limited to one role. Players who can adapt. Players who understand positional football. Konsa fits that concept. He isn't being presented as a flashy signing. He isn't the kind of transfer that immediately dominates social media in the same way a superstar attacker would. But these are often the signings that managers value enormously. Because football squads are built through balance. You need the superstar, but you also need the player who can step in when the superstar is unavailable. You need the player who can play three positions. You need the experienced player who understands pressure. And you need players who can maintain standards during a 60-game season. That is where Konsa could become extremely valuable. And then there is the £50 million fee. Now let's talk about the money. £50 million is a significant investment. There is no way around that. Arsenal would be spending major money on a 28-year-old defender. But transfer fees have changed dramatically. Elite Premier League defenders command enormous valuations, and Arsenal are no longer operating as a club simply looking for bargains. They are trying to compete with the biggest clubs in Europe. That means paying premium prices for players who can immediately improve the squad. The real question isn't simply, is £50 million a lot?